Good morning. Welcome to a webinar from Gitar and with folks from Amazon and Uber. My name is Gotham. I am the co-founder and CTO at Gitar. I was at Uber previously for about 10 years working on developer tooling. And I'm joined today by my panelists, Ty and Carlos. Would love for you folks to introduce yourself. Do you want to go, Ty?
Yeah, thanks, Gotham. I'm Ty Smith. I'm a principal engineer at Uber, working in the developer platform organization. Used to work with Gotham for many years. I wear a lot of hats, but most of them are around dev productivity in some regard. Did a lot of mobile in the past, and the last couple of years have been really diving deep into AI DevX, and I think that's going to be exciting to talk about today.
Awesome. Yeah, pretty exciting. Carlos?
Good morning. My name is Carlos. I'm a senior principal engineer at Amazon. I work in the worldwide stores side of the business. I've been at Amazon for about 13 years. I've also spent time at Google 4 years and Microsoft 12 years. And in all those companies, has been some sort of developer productivity related things. So dev productivity is a thing that I've always been super passionate about.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all for being here. And just as a reminder for folks, there is a Slido in the chat where you can ask questions and also upvote. So we will be monitoring that, and we'll have time towards the end where Ty and Carlos can answer some of your questions as well. So feel free to take advantage of that. And we're for 2 minutes in, so I can get started at this point. So just to set some context, the topic that we're talking about is agentic AI and how it really impacts developer productivity, code maintenance. And this is a very interesting area because right now what we're seeing in the industry, there is a lot of code being generated by tons of these AI assistants. It was not the case just about a year ago. There's a lot more interest from across the industry about how do we improve developer productivity, how do we move faster, ship things. But there's a whole slew of issues with this approach because there's a bunch of stuff that happens after code is written, maintaining that code, making sure it's secure, testing it, making sure people can understand it. And that's not being talked about as much. So we thought we would get Ty and Carlos to can also talk about how they've been approaching it at scale and some of the challenges in adopting these tools, making sure developers trust, and how do you validate that the tools are doing the right thing for you, right? And how do you even evaluate and adopt new tools? So there's a lot of fun stuff we're gonna be covering. And yeah, would you folks want to add anything, Ty, Carlos?
No, it's just I think both of our organizations are making very heavy investments, and the industry in general is going full steam ahead for AI, and especially the agentic approaches to these. And there's a lot of interesting opportunity, but a lot of interesting challenges in front of us as well, especially as a lot of this isn't quite in a mature spot yet. I keep telling our leaders we're kind of building the plane while we're flying it. And so we'll be talking about a bit of that today.
Yeah, I am 100%. I think that we're in kind of this really interesting inflection point where our job tomorrow is going to be very different from our job yesterday. And we've had other inflection points in the industry, like the internet, like phones becoming mainstream. But this is a much more foundational shift. So I'm excited and terrified both at the same time.
Awesome. Cool. So that's the context. And just to kick things off, I would love to ask some questions to you folks. So we talked about agentic, I think Ty brought up agentic AI use. I would love to hear some stories from you folks. How have you maybe experienced this at your workplace? Do you have any story about how you use agentic AI to do any sort of migration, testing, developer productivity effort? Would love to hear. Maybe we can start with you, Ty.
Yeah, thanks, Gotham. Yeah, I think it'd be an interesting story to talk about some of the bigger investments we've been making in the last year. So starting, last year, all of us saw the papers and earnings reports from companies like Google and Microsoft talking about 30% of their code is AI generated, 50% of their code is AI generated. And we really started looking at that and saying, what does this actually mean? What does this look like? Is this for real? They just have an LLM running and they're committing this code, or what's the deeper story here? And as we started connecting with with other organizations and talking deeply. One thing that we found was obviously there was a bunch of AI assistants that are helping people out, and that's being accounted for. But the other one is that some of these mature organizations had very, very rich large-scale change infrastructure that had already been in place for many years and scaled out, democratized migrations, things like that. And as AI came into the space, it becomes additive to that existing system. They already have a healthy machine running for these large-scale changes across their entire repo set. So now they add AI to that, and it's a superpower that gets added. And at Uber, we've always had a lot of large-scale changes running, but that's an area where we hadn't really doubled down on what is like one polished, mature system look like for handling large-scale changes. Many of them were bespoke, and they were different language to language, and there was different scripting or tooling that was put in place. And so we put together a program that we've been calling Auto Migrate, which is a large-scale cross-team program to democratize large-scale changes and invest in all areas of that. And it fits into 4 pillars. There's kind of the problem identification, where you understand what the migration looks like and the risk and what type of tools you want to use. The code transformation piece, where you might use tools like Gitar or Open Rewrite or other AST transformers to do code transforms itself. Some sort of verification stage where you're saying, how are we actually proving that this migration was correct? Were tests enough? Do we need to do more? And then finally, some sort of campaign management where you're saying, I might have thousands of PRs that need to get reviewed and rebased regularly. How do I get this landed? And one of the really exciting projects that we've been applying that to is something, if you've been following me, you've probably seen me talk a little bit about it, but we've been migrating our Android code base, which is many million lines of code from Java to Kotlin. And we had been doing this organically for a long time. We've been building tools and putting that in the hands of devs. But the speed at which that was going was going to take us 8 or 10 years organically, with teams just using some of the assistance tools to migrate their code. And so we asked, could we do this faster centrally? And could we do this faster with AI? The answer to both of those is yes, but in progress. We're not done yet. And we started with just taking the traditional AST types of tools that we were using. We're building on top of the IntelliJ JDK tool, working with JetBrains on improving that tool, and then working with Meta on building pre and post processors so we could create more idiomatic Kotlin. Developers were using this in their workflows. We started bringing this centrally into a pipeline and writing more of these transformers, which were built on top of just the Kotlin C visitor pattern. And that was going great, except we knew that we would have to get to hundreds of these recipes written to get to real idiomatic code produced. And so we said, could AI help us go faster here? What we then did is we took years of human-written migrations that we know had been happening, and we created a large data set. We trained an LLM. We ended up having that suggest the recipes, discover and suggest recipes that would need to be written, ones that would be generalizable and ones that wouldn't. Out of those, we were able to bootstrap and accelerate the recipes that we were writing. Now that's taking us in the right direction, but it's still going a bit slower. And so then now we're getting into the world where we're saying, well, can we use Agentic AI with all of these MCP connections to speed that up any faster and have a full loop where we will be doing the transformation, reviewing the code, seeing the gaps with the agent, going back through the LLM suggestion process for writing a new recipe, rerunning that recipe, and kind of going through a loop until we have that. One thing that we're thinking about is, if we just threw the LLM do the migration itself, it might work, but scaling that out consistently for millions of lines of code would have a lot of challenges. There would be hallucinations, there would be one-off problems. And if we need folks to review millions of lines of code, they're not going to give every single line the same level of skepticism, and things are going to slip through. That's going to cause production issues. And so, we've been investing more in this. How do we take a deterministic approach? How do we build more of those with the AI, have an agent orchestrate it? Build more into the verification stages as we go. And that's kind of the process we're going in now. And hopefully we'll finish this. I think we have about 4 million lines of Java left to migrate. And hopefully within about 2 years, we'll be able to knock all that out.
That's a super amazing story. I think the thing you talked about, like having a very mature pipeline or ecosystem, is actually like the key thing, I think, because without that, it's hard to actually enact this kind of change centrally across the entire organization, because there's obviously like grassroots level stuff happening, but that will just take way longer. So having this sort of pipeline actually makes things so much more seamless, looks like.
Absolutely. It brings up a lot of other interesting challenges we can talk about later, but it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Awesome. So I'd love to hear from Carlos. How are you folks approaching this? How have you deployed it? Where did you see Agentic AI being like useful for you folks?
Yeah. I joined the Amazon store about 18 months ago, and ever since I've been thinking a lot about testing specifically. And the reason is twofold. One, because I've always been passionate about testing and engineering and operational excellency and developer productivity. But two, because with all this code being auto-generated, being able to test it and making sure that it does what you think it does is even more important than it was before. So it's a place where I've been spending a lot of time. And coming into the Amazon store was kind of a shift for me because I've always been a back-end distributed systems guy. I've always been thinking about, how do thousands of servers interact and scale with each other? But for the Amazon store specifically, what's more interesting is the end-to-end testing experience. And so really what it means is, how do we test the Amazon store on mobile? Because Amazon.com started as a website, and more people these days use this on mobile apps and or on iOS than on the website. So, we're going through this cultural shift of thinking mobile first, which has been hard for a company that's been, website for 20 something years. And so when I joined the store 18 months ago, I started diving into how do we test it? And the bottom line is there's thousands of engineers, it's highly federated. There's 20 different frameworks. People write tests, end-to-end tests, and Selenium, Appium, Espresso, the list goes on, right? And so trying to make sense out of this world was quite hard. And also tests were very hard to write because you need framework knowledge. You need to know how to use that particular framework. And they tend to be pretty flaky because you have pop-ups that show up and your automation doesn't know what to do with a pop-up, or they tend to rely pretty heavily on the DOM. So if anything changes, like an element changes in the DOM. So these are not great tests to have. They're flaky, they're hard to do, and so forth. And so that was one problem that I've been thinking about for a while. And kind of in parallel, we've been investing more and more in Gen AI based execution of tests. So if I give you a test in natural language, can we use an LLM to do that? So my test would just say, go to the Amazon store, search for Harry Potter, make sure that Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is in the search results, add it to the cart, make sure it's in the cart. I've just given you a test in plain English, natural language. And can we send a test like that to an LLM? And can then LLM navigate the Amazon store UI and do what we want? And what we've been finding in this journey, we've been doing this for about 18 months, is that LLMs are amazingly good at end-to-end testing. They are so much better at that than they are at generating code, which is funny because all we seem to be talking about is, like LLMs generating code and vibe coding and all that. And it's like, there's a massive opportunity here in testing. And so kind of putting those two threads together, we're investing a lot in using natural language and Gen AI based execution for new tests. But also we have hundreds of thousands of legacy tests that we need to decide what to do. Do we migrate them to natural language? Do we keep them as is? And so I'm personally really excited about migrating a lot of these things because I think it's just a better approach. It's a lot more reliable, kind of long term. You got to shuffle where the puck is going. And the main problem I have is how to build trust that the LMs are doing the right thing. And so I'm happy to talk more about, how, ways in which we're building trust that migrating these tests from deterministic, old traditional tests to, letting the LLM do a lot more of the work. How do we trust the results? So,
Yeah, that's a very interesting contrast because I think Ty mentioned they were preferring to use deterministic techniques when possible to do code migrations, but in this case, it's like the opposite. Deterministic is actually not good because it's too restrictive and too formulaic. It needs to be flexible and malleable in some sense. So it's interesting to like use a combination of techniques to get what the outcome is. That's pretty cool, actually. I think that's a great segue into our discussion topic, which is just around, I think, you folks mentioned some tools. There's a bunch of also like tools on the market right now. There's a lot of noise, and I feel like there's too many tools that teams have time to evaluate. It's almost like they're doing 50 tools of evaluation every quarter at this point. I'm looking at you, Ty, because I think you're doing this probably at Uber right now. So I would love to learn from you folks. Like, how do you think about like the trust aspect of things, like how do you evaluate tools? What are some, like we can maybe like dive into first understanding like what's even blocking wider adoption, right? Because I think unlike previous adoption curves where things would be sticky, there's just so many new tools. People want to try new stuff. So, and are you seeing like people taking it up easily? Were there trust issues that prevent adoption? I would love to learn from you folks' experience deploying this at scale.
Sure. Maybe I could take a start at this. So, I might start at the meta level and quote a friend of mine at a different company. They refer to this entire space and these tools as finding the leader of the quarter, because it's moving so fast and there's so many, evolutionary steps in these tools. You have the models competing with each other, but you have, the tools themselves. Is it, Cursor or Windsurf or VS Code or IntelliJ? Like all of these tools are, putting in all this innovation and they're leapfrogging each other, and it's so fast that making long-term bets right now is very risky for the business, right? If we just said, cool, we're going to pick this one thing and we're going to hitch our horse to this for the next 3 years, it's very likely we made the wrong decision, and we're going to be left behind, or we're going to have a very expensive migration. And so one of the principles I've been pushing on for us is that we need to unlock optionality, and we need to be very nimble in both using the tools and being able to move on when other things are showing promise and are really surpassing that. At the same time, you want to kind of minimize thrashing our developers and causing too much noise there. So there is this balance that we're trying to take of evaluating and figuring out what does have a little bit of longevity and bringing those in. And so a lot of that is unlocking several and putting the ones that we think have high likelihood of being successful into the hands of like some beta engineers internally, getting feedback, really using the human qualitative element to see where benefit is being added. And getting those into the hands of folks while also thinking about like maybe some long-term convergence is more of like an ecosystem play. Maybe there's some more open source clients pointing at frontier models. Maybe that's a little easier to unlock and invest on top of than a pure vendor locked-in solution. We've also been thinking a lot about how do we optimize for cost and everything else in this situation. So it's been a little bit more of an art than a science in evaluating some of these and making sure, we kind of use that human element. But, coming back to what's blocking wider adoption, there is a person element to this. Like people can only spend so much time keeping up with the latest tools and switching. There's a fire hose of information. So we're having to both make explicit room for that in our culture and like get experimentation and learning time in the hands of engineers, but then also not putting that entire cost onto them of evaluating every single thing that comes through. And so it's this mix that I think is an interesting challenge. And then obviously a lot of these aren't polished yet, right? Like again, I'll say it feels like we're kind of building the plane while we're flying it. Like we're figuring out more about security and risk. We're figuring out more about guardrails. Where there is not going to be like a plateaued S-curve of this technology. We can't wait for it to be done and then start using it. So we need to start training the organization and the people on using these tools and pulling them into their workflow and being more nimble with changes over time. And so that's the training that we're doing right now. It's less of here's the new workflow, you're going to be using this indefinitely, and more of training the speed of change in our engineers and getting them to incrementally use those over time. And then as this matures and as workflows change, people can stay up to date with that. I think I had a VP recently said, AI is not going to take your job. It's going to be an engineer using AI that takes your job. So it definitely, we need to be constantly like training our folks and to be using these effectively. And as they change, retraining our engineers. And this is some of the organizational challenges and friction that we're seeing with how we keep up with that in a fast moving space.
Oh yeah, I think that's there's a lot of like things to chew on there. I think the fact that you have to be so much more up to speed, and it's much more difficult with training just being not even like a optional thing anymore. It's a completely new way to work with these things. It really depends on how you prompt, how you use, how you make it part of your workflow. And it's not even like one size fits all. It's just one size fits one, and making it work for you. So it's cool that I think carving out that time is actually what makes sense to like learn and train and give them that freedom and agency to do this. And I would love to like learn from your experience, Carlos. Like, what are some of the blockers you have for like wide adoption, trust. I think I would love to see like it's a much bigger company also, I think. Also like more, I think different like dynamics than Uber. So I'd love to learn what you folks are saying.
Yeah, I've become more comfortable embracing chaos. And so, yes, Amazon is a big place. There's 60, 70,000 devs. And even internally, we have intersecting tools in Gen AI. And for me, that's a little strange. It was a little strange initially because I tend to be the guy that always pushes for convergence. I'm always worried about, like, regardless of every director optimizing locally for their org, like I want to optimize globally for the company. That's my job. So I've pushed for big convergences both at Google and Amazon, but I actually have a different mindset on this, where I think that there's a time and a place for convergence, and there's a time and a place for experimentation. And we're in that phase now where it's perfectly fine to have, even internal competing tools, because we need to try things out. And some of the things that we try, we're like, no, 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 that didn't work at all, or like the ROI of this is much greater than the ROI of that. So, we are in that phase where everything's moving so fast and it's so chaotic, and we're all trying to figure it out together. Like Ty say, flying the plane where you're building it at the same time. So I kind of think like let a thousand flowers bloom these days. I think another problem that we've had is cultural, which is some some of the pushes for Gen AI were a little too early. And when Gen AI came out, and we started thinking about Gen AI for generating code and so forth, like there's a huge hype, and everybody was like, well, this will replace you entirely. Like, and so a lot of people started using it, and the technology wasn't there yet, and so they became very disillusioned, or maybe they had incorrect expectations of what it could do, right? And so they tried it, they didn't like it, they became disillusioned, and now it's really hard to convince them to try it again. But like if you tried something 12 months ago, if you try it today, it's a very, very different world. Like these technologies have really moved. And so kind of balancing, when do we do top-down mandates to push for adoption of something that we believe in, and when do we kind of encourage organic adoption and kind of go, either top-down or bottom-up? So um, those are all things on my mind these days.
That's really interesting. I think you mentioned measuring ROI, which I wanted to kind of double click on. So given there's so many tools and they're also new and people are like evaluating them rapidly, like how do you measure ROI? Like, because I feel like people probably are spending a lot of time with these tools uh, to even look at it just as like, hey, time saved, because I feel like time using these tools, just get used to them, is an investment in itself. So what's your take on, what's both of your take on like, how do you measure ROI? Like, are there traditional metrics that used to work before for dev productivity? Are they still working? Do we need to change how we evaluate exactly?
Yeah, I'll, I think one thing that I've been thinking about is that we have to think about more dimensions for measuring something. And so, in my case of how do I measure the ROI of the investments that we're making in testing? Well, executing tests with LLMs is more expensive in terms of hardware. So, that's one dimension, is these tests are a little bit more expensive, and that's for sure. At some point, we're all going to be fighting each other for GPUs, if not now already. There's a higher latency for that, but there's things that we're doing to cache and improve latency and so forth. So, like, these are some of the dimensions, because by moving to LM based testing, they're going to be more expensive and they're going to take longer. So, like, those are some dimensions. But like, we're also measuring how long it's taking for you to create a test in a traditional programming language, and how much does it take you to create a test in natural languages. So that's a dimension. It's like, how long does it take you to create the test? But then another dimension is, how long does it take for maintenance? So, when you generate code, you're now in the hook for maintaining that code. So next log4j update or whatever it is, like, you've got to drop whatever you're doing and do that security update. But when you're investing in natural languages, you don't have as much maintenance. And then flakiness. So these tests are going to fail a lot less. So that's human time that you're saving, because your developers are not having to drop everything they're doing and troubleshoot a test that failed. So there's all these different dimensions. And then At the end of the day, you're almost comparing apples to oranges. So you have to decide, out of all these dimensions, how do I weight these dimensions? How important is it for me to save engineering time? And I'm okay saving engineering time if I use more hardware, or if it takes a little bit longer to ship, that sort of thing. And we're all trying to figure out what the balance is.
Yeah, that's I guess the point is to try not to optimize too many variables at once. Right?
And to not optimize for just one variable either.
Yeah.
Which is like, we all like simple solutions, right? Like, so tell me that one metric that's developer productivity. Great, right? No, that doesn't exist.
I mean, it's even worse now with being way easier to generate code. Like the traditional just volume of code or some sort of PR metric doesn't really scale at all. So I'd love to hear from you, Tyler. How are you folks thinking about ROI? Because you have, I think, a very rich set of developer metrics, I remember, at Uber.
Yeah, so Uber's historically a very quantitative, data-driven organization. We put a lot of emphasis on, on things we can measure actively. But I think if you look at developer productivity as a whole, still the cutting edge way to measure developer productivity, from research is you ask your developers, right? It's the qualitative. It's survey science and statistical significance, and you can do all those in a way that gets that information. And so I do think at the core of it, we are talking about, developer productivity is human time spent. And this, developers are craftspeople, they're not factory workers. Measuring each specific thing can be valuable in isolation, but it doesn't tell that whole picture about what a developer, how productive a dev is. They're only spending 10 to 20% of their time writing code. Right, the rest of the time they're debugging, or they're pair programming, or they're designing, or they're in meetings. Like there's a lot of other job roles. And so thinking about how we actually make folks more productive becomes quite challenging to measure quantitatively. And so we've leaned, and we continue to push more on leading with the time saved for the developers. That's qualitative, but also for the specific projects that are being done, it's understanding the output and how much that output is worth. If that's a migration, how much should it take to do that migration before on average, and then you multiply that out by the number of maybe files we're converting. If that's fixing a flaky test, like what does the study say, how long it takes to fix those, and then we have a number of flaky tests. So it ends up being in this dev years saved metric that becomes one of our primaries. And then we have a bunch of secondary trailing metrics that are more targeted for the specific project, right? Like maybe if if it's the flaky tests, then it can be around quality and CI stability. If it's around code review, then it can be on the review time being shorter in time, or the time to first review. There's a lot of these trailing metrics we can start to track and aggregate as well. And then telling that holistic picture up is what's important. You can't have one silver bullet metric. You can't say, PRs per engineer. Historically, that's been an important one to us. And actually, I strongly hypothesize that's going to be a really problematic metric for all of us in the future, because with AI generating more code, it's going to first take away all the toil work, right? It's going to take away fixing the flaky test or doing the library bump or the other stuff that we see. And that's going to leave the engineers to focus on higher level, more creative business value type of projects. Those usually aren't quick. They have more stakeholders to deal with. They have more challenges, more review process. Those are going to take longer. So when we've talked to other companies that are a little further along in this journey of like the large scale changes and centralizing all that, they've actually seen their developer PRs go down. And so we expect that to be a really interesting story of, as more AI generated code is there, how valuable is that? We suspect the overall number of commits might go up as AI is there for the business. But if you can't tie that to a specific individual, it's much different, right? And so we need to think about some of the things we haven't solved yet, but like, how do we think about measuring maybe features delivered, or other types of more atomic units that represent the value that's going out? And then we would apply the business units that are working on that to kind of measure their output.
Absolutely. Seems like we have a few questions coming in now, so I would like to maybe try to close out this discussion, and then we could jump into questions. So the last couple of things I would love to cover. You mentioned job roles and how it's been kind of evolving. It's less code because code's just getting written. but the amount of work is not reducing for developers. So I would love to learn, like, how do you think the systems and operations of large scale companies generally would evolve in the future? Like, is it going to be more management of these agentic AI? Like, how does that even look like? Do you folks have like a, if you had to like make a prediction to the future, about like, hey, how does job security look like given all that AI can do? Right? Like, how do roles like change? What do you think is going to be the future where what would be automated, what would be hard to automate? Would love to get your take on this because you guys are at the forefront of this now.
Yeah, I can take a stab at this first. First I'll say I'll repeat my statement earlier. Predicting the future right now with things moving so fast, it's a bit of a fool's errand. So if I looked at my crystal ball, it would maybe have 20 different potential ways this could go. But where I kind of think this is going is yes, our job roles will be fundamentally changing, and they may change many times over throughout this process. And what that I think that'll look like is more. This will become more of an implementation detail and key in everything that we're doing. And you might end up with a few different archetypes. I think the very common archetype will be an engineer who's working on customer facing things, like the typical product engineer. And they will be heavily using AI. And this role is going to need to evolve from someone who just thinks about the code for the thing they're delivering to a full kind of customer polyglot. Almost think about like a very technical product manager or a very technical designer, where they're thinking about the whole picture and the customer, and then they're using the agents and occasionally going a little bit deeper into the system. I think maybe game development is a really interesting analogy here, where the tools you would usually use for like Unreal and other things, you get a lot more visual workflows where you have like nodes that are interconnected and you can see the assets that are attached on them or the levels, but you can also then click in and expand the functions or the other bits that are being utilized there. So I do think we'll get more into this like agent orchestration product development, where the code will still be there, but it's probably not the first pane of glass that engineers will be thinking about. They'll be stepping into it lower on rarer occasions. So I think that'll be a very common archetype that develops. And I think that the product, the engine, the design will kind of all go in a convergence direction to some degree. Then I think you will still get some of your typical like platform infra type of engineering, but it'll be a much smaller subset. And these will be the people that are kind of going full up and down the stack, and they need to like really click in deep and debug and like look how these systems are interconnecting together and really understand what kind of all the agents are doing. And this might be the evolution of what people are calling like an AI engineer today. And then your maybe higher level engineers or product folks will be the ones that are thinking about bringing several of these product areas together and business continuity and the typical stuff that you would see in like a higher level engineer today.
Great.
I like the idea of archetypes. We're debating that too, because I think the composition of teams is definitely going to change. So we're having all these debates about what is the right composition of a team in 2 years, 5 years from now. Does it look the same in terms of the seniority of the engineers? Is it even engineers? Is it another type of builder? I was thinking about this. I like to use this a lot. There's an IBM ad from 1950, and it's introducing some calculator, and it says, this new calculator will replace 150 engineers. And that was the sales pitch, right? And well, like it didn't actually eliminate jobs, right? We didn't fire 150 engineers because we bought a calculator. Because we had this new capability, we're able to do more interesting things like going to the moon. And so I'm excited about what things can we do that represent a kind of an exponential leap that we couldn't do before. And another thing that I think about is software engineers on average spend only about 20% of their time actually writing code. And there's all kinds of white papers on this from Microsoft, Google, Meta. And so software engineer is not just a programmer. There's all kinds of other things that you do as a software engineer. You're in meetings, you're testing, your operations, you're responding to tickets, you're talking to customers. And so there's all these other different parts of your world that we should also be thinking more holistically about. How does Gen AI change all these things? Because even if, okay, so if engineers spend 20% of their time writing code, we make you 50% faster. That's still only 10% improvement in productivity. But there's a lot more opportunities than that if you look at the whole holistic story, and what are the other places that we can be Gen AI assisted.
Absolutely. I think that's a good segue into questions. I think there's a lot of very interesting ones. I'm not sure we'll be able to get through all of them. We'll spend about 10 minutes, and then we'll try to see if there's more left. We will be able to answer them. We have a Slack on Gitar Slack, the Gitar.ai website. You can pop in and ask questions as well. But the top one I think came up was, how are you measuring code quality with all this AI generated code? Is AI generated code making it harder for devs to understand code or track down bugs? I'll have you, one of you answer it maybe. Maybe Ty, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I would say one, this is a in progress, investment, right? But starting kind of with the first principles, we are taking the stance that AI generated code should be the same quality as human generated code, and that an engineer responsible for that is responsible for the code. They are not delegating responsibility to the AI. They own that code, and it goes through the standard code review practices, expectations from the styles, the quality, the testing, everything else you would expect. So just starting with the expectation as the engineer, even if they get worse quality code from AI, they're responsible to improve that to the bar that is acceptable to be checked in is one. And then I think you get into like, what are the guardrails? How do you actually enact that in practice? How do you measure this? These are all areas that, this is where I think the in progress is happening. Like we, of course, have a lot of quantitative measurements that we're doing around code quality in general, test coverage and bug counts and other things. And so we are tracking that closely to ensure that that is staying the same or going down, like getting better even. Similar with like our incident tooling, we're starting to figure out how we can track if something was AI caused or not. There have been cases now where like an incident or something happened and it was related in part to an engineer using AI, and they needed to kind of address that, and there were some learnings from that. But as we continue to invest in this space and put in the better tools for code quality, actually, I think AI has been an interesting one. We have this project around generating tests, and part of the test coverage was creating a skeptic for understanding test quality and starting to look at things like change detector tests or other stuff that would be harder to detect in a traditional linter. How can we extract that out and then apply the same bit of like, not just code generation, but code skeptics and review and other pieces in the system to help up level quality? So we're investing in both of these kind of in parallel, and we expect both of them to be improving.
Awesome. Yeah, there's some pretty interesting way to like use, I think they're calling it like personas for agents. Like you at the same agent look at it from a different angle. Cool. So there's another question around like tool use. I think a bunch of questions around which AI tools to use. And I think this one's more to you, Carlos. Someone asked like, hey, have you found the tools available in the market are not good enough for your needs? How do you decide when it's worth it to build an internal tool? So could you maybe talk about some of the tools you use? When is it worth internal versus buy?
Yeah. Well, Amazon is kind of an interesting kind of size where a lot of times internal investments make a little bit more sense than if you're a smaller company. And so we tend to do a lot of things internally simply because the size justifies it. The other example that I use is, well, Google has their own IDE. It's called Cider. They don't sell it. They don't make any money out of it. They just have their engineers use it. Why would they do that? Well, they have 120,000 engineers. They're highly paid. So this is, like billions of dollars of productivity. So if you have your own IDE and that helps their engineers be 1% faster, that justifies its cost. So we do a lot of things internally, but we're always looking at the industry to see what can we get from there. So it's constantly evaluating over and over again, I think.
Gotcha. Awesome. There's a lot more questions. I think the ones I'll go back to Slido. There's one around reducing flakiness of tests by agentic AI, and then a similar one around like auto healing, the CI system. How do you like detect what's flaky and what's an actual failure? I think Carlos, you are passionate about testing, so this one's going to be for you. Like, how do you detect flakiness? How do you reduce flakiness? You talked a bit about it. Would like to dive a little deeper.
Yeah, so we already have, and this is, I'll stay within end-to-end testing first, but we have a lot of flakiness already, because this is a space where, like, because of DOM and pop-ups and things like that, it's like these tests are naturally flaky. So the bar is really low already, which is good. But one of the things that we're doing when we are migrating tests from a traditional framework to an LLM-based framework is we actually have both suites running for a while, and 1 month, 2 months, and we're comparing the results of these two. And what we want to determine is, when they disagree, which one's correct? Is it the LLM or is it the more traditional one? And the surprising thing is we're finding that LLMs, because they're a little bit more creative, they end up finding bugs that or automation never found, even though the test is the same in air quotes, simply because LLMs are kind of thinking about this differently. So we are doing a lot of side by side comparisons and so forth to build some trust in these. We're also thinking a lot about the guardrails that we want to put, because let me give you an example of a very, very early test that we're running with our guardrails. The instructions were, go to the Amazon store, log in with his username and password, and either the username or the password were incorrect, so the LM couldn't do it. But LMs are pretty resourceful, so it saw that there was a way to create a new account, and it's like, okay, well, you told me to log in, so I'm going to create a new account so I can log in, and it went that route completely unsupervised, and that didn't work. But the LM was like really determined to succeed. So it saw that there was a way to contact customer support, and it started chatting with customer support to try to like work out its own problem. And that's when we stopped the test. We're like, okay, so we need some guardrails around this. Um, and so when you let your test run while with LMs, like, you got to think about guardrails. And so a lot of what we're doing these days is hybrid, where we're saying for these things, we want you to specifically do A, B, and C. For these other things, like, be a little more creative. That's cool. And so, for example, anything related to setting up your test, getting to whatever it is that you want to test, like, by all means, be creative and get to where you need to be. But at that point, like, we switch over. So I think hybrid mode is the way to go for a while.
I would have loved to see that that chat transcript between the agent and the test runner.
It was fascinating. Yeah.
What's funny is the customer support is also an agent. So it's like, oh, I see you're trying to get into the testing system.
Next thing you know, they start developing their own language to talk to each other, and then we're all in trouble.
Well, there's another question, I think, for Ty specifically around Uber's Android code base. So this is around, did you run into any context size issues given the large Android code base? You mentioned multiple million lines of code. What is the biggest bang for buck wins you found? And then what are your biggest surprises?
Yeah, so definitely context size can be a problem, or at least get very expensive when you're sending those up to the frontier models as they get larger and larger context windows and doing those in an agentic flow. And so what we've tried to do is deterministically finding like the right set of context and passing that along via RAG. And so, for example, in the workflow that does the migration from Java to Kotlin, it is using a headless IntelliJ instance for the core bit of the J2K processor from IntelliJ. And then it has the pre-processor recipes and the post-processor recipes that are running outside of the LLM altogether. That still has some cost associated with it because it's such a large monorepo. You have to index that into the IDE so that it has, the type understanding so that it can make the right type of migration. It needs to understand, the types in other modules and things so it can understand if something's nullable or not. And so that is just like from a capacity and timing perspective already expensive. Then when you start to think about like the agents and the LLMs, because a lot of that is deterministic, not all of that is necessary to be provided as context. So for the rule generation bit, the migrations themselves were the ones that were just the PRs, not necessarily the entire repo. For each migration was the ones that were handed up along with the the source of the conversion engine and a bunch of other stuff. Yes, it's a large context window, but it's not the full monorepo. Similarly, when we're starting to do like the agentic runner, it won't be the full monorepo again. It might be the specific module or the specific file that we're trying to target, using something like skip to find the relevant references that are in the surrounding area that we want to pull into that. And then, because we're still wanting this agent to run the deterministic tools, it'll be more around like how are the tools running? What is the output of the tools? All of that sort of bits. And so we'll very rarely be in a case where we want to supply the entire repo up. Outside of that Java to Kotlin story, if you look at other tools like Cursor or Windsurf or VS Code, they are all kind of doing their own things to try to pass up these large repos as context that's relevant, and they're doing symbol lookup, and they're doing caching, and they're doing other techniques to try to minimize that. You very rarely see a case where you just give millions of lines of code to an LLM, and that's one of the things we have to kind of optimize around right now. So looking into things like better RAG with skip, I think is something I'd recommend if you're trying to pursue this yourself.
Yeah, so just to want to add on to that, so we at Gitar do agentic code maintenance for very large code bases, 50 million lines of code plus. So some of the techniques we found useful are multi-agents. So each works on different pieces of context. Context compaction, as things get over time, we keep track of hey, what's going on in a separate memory, and then we compact stuff that's already been done because that's not relevant anymore. And then some other techniques like skip, what I mentioned, is just it's like a source code intelligence protocol from SourceGraph. It just lets you kind of jump and find references, kind of like how you do an IDE. You just pull in the right bits of stuff, code. So there's a lot more techniques like this you can use to minimize context. And what we have found is actually doing these kind of agents on a small code base is easy, but doing it at scale, there's a lot of elbow grease you got to put in to make them work. So just wanted to add that. And then there's a bunch of questions around sorry, go ahead. Yeah, someone said something. Okay, there's a bunch of questions around measuring percentage of AI generated code. This is an interesting one. I feel like people want to know, do you folks have any way to measure how much code is AI generated? How do you think about that metric? And how do you think about duplication of this code? Just because agents generally don't tend to update existing code, they'll just write new code because that's what they're primed to do. So maybe Carlos, do you have any thoughts on this one?
This is one that we're debating a lot too. So, I'm coming back to Ty's analogy on flying the plane where you're still building it. We are keeping track of things like that, but we don't really know what the right number is, right? So right now we're just still learning, I would say.
Yeah, this is a tough one because usually it goes through some form of a developer anyway. So I don't know if it's apt to say it's AI generated because it's always going to be human reviewed. You never wanted to just do stuff on its own because it can go wrong in many bizarre ways. So I think the better metric might be hey, how much of this code is not being reviewed and making sure it's reviewed.
We've been talking a lot about this internally as well. And I think right now we're falling back to estimating as opposed to tracking it all because it is coming from several different tools, right? Like I mentioned, we're giving optionality to our devs. So, is it coming from a user who is using Claude Code, or is it coming from Cursor? Is it coming from VS Code, or is it coming from one of our migration tools that's under a bot, or is it coming from an IntelliJ, Junie or JetBrains AI Assist or one of these? If we had a deterministic way of for every single one of those consistently tracking it, maybe that would be nice in practice. I don't know what we would do with that data. I don't know that is anything more than interesting. Are we trying to drive that up? Are we trying to drive it down? I think the overall, be like saying what percentage of your code is copied from Stack Overflow. It's just another input into it. And I think you care more about the outcomes and the review and the quality than the way that folks get that into it. So, maybe tracking the tools and their usage and understanding if people aren't using it and addressing, their pain points is a better use of your time. And then to the other point around it having a tendency to generate more code versus reuse, I would say humans do the same thing, especially in larger code bases. Teams optimize for unblocking themselves and doing the exact same thing. So I don't really see that as an AI versus human problem. I see it as an incentive problem, and something that isn't solved right now, but obviously will get better over time.
That
Yeah,
is one of the things that we solve at Gitar, by the way. So if you're interested, hit us up after.
I think, to Ty's point, like the percentage of code that is generated by AI is kind of a meaningless number, because like, is 20% good? Is 50% good? Is 100% good? I don't want a leader to say my org has to have, whatever. Here's the target. We need to have 60% of code generated, because it's kind of meaningless. It doesn't say anything about the value of that code or the quality of that code. Like, we have to think in many dimensions. I want to make sure that we don't over-index on that.
AI also tends to write a ton more documentation. So it's just like, hey, we have a bunch of stuff, but the outcome is not going to change. So there was a question about MCP. I think, Ty, you mentioned MCP a while back and how you're thinking about in the agentic space. So what are your views on it? I think people want to know, there's a lot of issues with the system because there's no real way to know what's official, what's not. There's just too many servers out there. It's kind of its own ecosystem now. It's been evolving like really rapidly. So also, like if you have thoughts also, Carlos, feel free to add. So we'd love to learn from you both how you think about MCP and agents.
We are heavily investing in MCP, and we're very bullish on the space. But there are obviously a lot of it's a very nascent space right now, and so while we're investing there, we're also thinking about like the right guardrails and the right integrations, and what in our like production ecosystem should have that versus not. Is there the concept of like read versus write? What are the workflows that people are using for this? When it comes to third-party MCP servers, how are we scanning these, looking for, like security issues, prompt injection? How are we finding the ones that we think are like the ones we want to like broadcast internally and say these are the recommended ones? So there's some governance aspect to it. I think from like the authentication perspective, that's also another interesting one where if you have, broad services and you're at an internet scale company, probably the off-the-shelf, Jira MCP or the other ones aren't going to work. You're going to need your custom internal bespoke ones that have some sort of standard auth. So we're thinking about what do like transport layers and a whole auth service mean, and how do we consistently apply that to MCPs? Then from an agent's perspective, you have tons of different agents. How do we consistently think about those and know when an agent's interacting with the system versus a human is interacting with the system? What do the permission models look like? All that is something that is active conversation going on right now. But again, we can't wait till that's all solved and then say, now we're going to adopt it. We'll miss the entire boat. So we need to be investing in this as we go. And that's how we're trying to think about this space, is using it, innovating, unlocking people that are excited while trying to put in place the foundations and the guardrails and everything else that are needed.
One thing that I'm super excited about is different agents that are experts in a particular thing and what that enables. So for example, one of the things that we're looking into is, so the LLM-based tests that we're doing are basically functional tests. Like do this, does this happen? But we are also working on injecting other experts into that flow. So for example, an agent that understands accessibility. So what does it mean to navigate the store as a blind person? And traditionally, the way that we would do it is we would have separate tests to make sure that accessibility guides are followed. But like with the ability to inject agents and have agents talk to other agents, like we can inject all these non-functional guardrails into every single functional test. And that's super exciting to me. We have so many different opportunities, like image quality. Agents can tell you, is this image grainy? Is this image correct given the text under that image? Things that you couldn't like easily test before. And so kind of injecting all these different agents to do different types of validation throughout the tests and doing that kind of globally is great, because we can inject accessibility throughout or every single test that we're doing. And it doesn't become some afterthought that a random team is doing, but it becomes a first class citizen that like is done on every single thing that we do.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. You mentioned the image part. So we also use a ton of MCPs at Gitar in how we generate like new migrations or new documentations. One of the things we've been doing is like when we generate something, we take a snapshot using an image tool of like a markdown we produce and say, hey, the content looks fine, but does it look good visually? Is it appealing? Is it easy to read? Right? Multimodality is like pretty cool like that. I think we also use a ton of MCPs or different like small use cases. So yeah, this is a very new area and it's not at all secure. So running it sandbox, making sure they're auth, making sure they're reliable and retriable is what happens at scale. And I think it's a good segue to the last few minutes. So there is going to be a part 2 of this webinar where we'll be more focused on more hands-on implementation and how you would use this in practice. So be on the lookout for that. And there is a Slack that I think we have in the chat, or you can also find it at gitar.ai. If you have more questions, we couldn't get to all of them, unfortunately, but wanted to give a few minutes to both Ty and Carlos to kind of key takeaways from each of you. If people want to find you, like kind of follow you on like social, if you have any like, LinkedIn or Twitter, just feel free to like, uh, mention those as well. So maybe we can start with you, Ty.
Yeah, I think my key takeaway that I'd want to leave everybody with is this is a very, very fast moving space, and it is impossible for most to keep up fully with everything that's going on. Instead of thinking about being an AI expert, think about how you would use some bits of AI in the existing expertise that you're comfortable in, applying it to that, starting that as kind of the gateway into this space. I wasn't an AI engineer years ago. I was a mobile engineer who cared a lot about developer productivity. I took that passion and then started applying AI as an implementation detail. I've had a person say to me recently that AI isn't is the salt, not the pasta. Right? It's just an implementation detail. So I would recommend to folks just making room for experimentation, finding the specific area that you're already comfortable with and augmenting that. That is like the key to getting started, as opposed to seeing it as very overwhelming and you need to absorb the entire ecosystem. So just making that constant room for experimentation and learning and having that regular cadence. We have teams at Uber where like every Friday afternoon is like a learning and experimentation time, and they're sharing their learnings with each other and pair programming on this stuff and hacking on things. Like finding the actual time to make room for learning this and playing with it is the really critical bit. And then if you want to follow me, my website has the links to all my socials. It's tysmith.me, tysmith.me. My LinkedIn, my Twitter, everything. I used to be pretty active on Twitter, not really these days. So LinkedIn's probably the thing where you'll find some of the updates and posts from my talks and other stuff.
Cool. Carlos?
Yeah. Same for me. So I just posted the link to LinkedIn, and that's where I'm most active, and I'm happy to connect. I post a fair bit on topics like these, and my 2 cents would be very similar to what I say, which is experiment, experiment, experiment. This is the time where you shouldn't be scared. I know there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about like, what does it mean? Do I have my job tomorrow? Is it going to do my job? And 100% believe that this is an enabler, not a replacer, but you have to evolve. And the industry is full of examples of like inflection points that happened and people that were unable or unwilling to adapt to a new way of doing things, and people who did. And so I think it's pretty urgent that we start experimenting and trying things out, and be willing to adapt, because like I said before, your job tomorrow is not going to be what your job yesterday was, and that's okay. Like we should be like excited about that.
Awesome. Yeah, I would say the same thing. My 2 cents is generally there's so many tools out there, so try them all. It's way easier than ever to like adopt these things because they're so quick to like try and just see what works and what doesn't work for you. Um, Definitely like come reach us out on guitar.ai as well. We have some stuff that's more around maintenance that we might be interested in. With that, I would like to like wrap up and say thanks a lot for your time, Ty and Carlos. It was really wonderful listening to your thoughts and like sharing all your experiences. I think it was super valuable, I think, for everyone, and hope to hear more from you on LinkedIn and on your social channels.
Thank you for having me. Great chatting with you guys.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.